Good evening, A Push class. Just a very quick screencast. I actually did it based on your reflections, and I took off. There were a few things you guys mentioned, but I just took off something about declaratory acts, and I thought we could clarify or clear up some of the things revolving around that. And the reality is, I think these screencasts will become more about the reflections piece, and then we can use those for these workspaces questions that I've been referring to, and hopefully we'll get more people to actually use the reflection sheets now via Google Form and look at the screencast. So what I did was I thought it might be important just to define first what Parliament is, and there's a few definitions, but I want you to think about this in two different ways, right? So the word Parliament um, from dictionary.com had five major definitions. The first and the fifth, though, I think are most important for us. Because if you were to ask the 1760s or 70s what Parliament is of a person in Great Britain, they would simply refer to number one in this list of five definitions. If you were to ask a person in the American colonies, they would probably refer to number one also, but you might have a growing number of people refer to number five as you get closer and closer to the revolution. And the reason for that is because you have to understand that during the period of salutary neglect, which again is that period where the American colonies are really left to their own devices. In fact, British Parliament, members of British Parliament actually said, let sleeping dogs lie. If they have their own mini legislatures, their own mini parliaments, if you will. Again, number five, for example, on this list, kind of let them have it. Let them have that ability because it really is not impacting us. But as we get closer and closer to the revolution, as Britain is having or experiencing a lot of problems, economic or otherwise, they start to enforce number one as a definition of parliament, right? The only parliament being their parliament. So you have this sort of less emphasis put on the smaller legislatures within the or lawmaking bodies like a parliament in the colonies, right? Because the colonies has never really been a formal method for having a legislature within the colonies, except that eventually or throughout as the colonies grew, the British Crown would place a governor in place of in charge of these colonies, right, to work with these individual legislatures. So just for emphasis, I put a picture of British Parliament as it is today, a picture of the inside as it is today. This is a picture of a later version, but still an 18th century. So this is what the House of Burgesses actually looks like in colonial Williamsburg today. It is what it would have looked like during the American Revolution, and this is the inside of that very same building. But I think the important point in all of this, when it comes to the Declaratory Act, is British Parliament basically clearing up any confusion over who is in charge. All right, so if we go back to these images for a minute and the definitions, the Declaratory Act is basically saying, we've repealed the Stamp Act. You got your way. You got your way with the Stamp Act. But understand that we're following a definition of Parliament and legislature being number one, not being number five. Okay, so we know there's been some confusion. There's been some a lack of clarity over this definition of number one versus number five here, right? The colonists feeling that number five is just as good as number one. In other words, their mini parliaments, their smaller legislatures being just as important as number one, and Parliament and the British Crown in the late 1760s is saying with the Declaratory Act, you may have gotten your way with repealing the Stamp Act, but the Declaratory Act is saying there should be no more confusion from this point forward. British Parliament is in charge, all right? The first one here is in charge. And this, obviously these images are in charge. And these other lawmaking bodies like the House of Burgesses in Virginia is not the group, the lawmaking body that American colonists should be following. Okay, so then you see that as it goes even further, right? After the Townshend Acts, one of the questions we had in class this week was, why is there no Townshend Acts Congress? And the reality is they've been banned. Okay, that's this parliament banning these parliaments, right? So literally taking away that fifth definition of what a parliament is. okay, at least in the American colonies. So I put one line here. The Declaratory Act is basically saying Parliament is within the Declaratory Act is basically saying we're in charge, not you. Okay, so just to reiterate, I wouldn't do it tomorrow; it would be unfair. But in coming days, as one of the questions on our daily quiz, I may ask you something about this screencast. So please make sure you take a look at it. All right, guys, have a good night. Get a good night's sleep.